was just walking through the kids' living quarters back to his room after eating in the kitchen when he heard the scream. Ah! It was the loudest he had ever heard Yonda, and it immediately pushed him into alert mode. Yonda! Yonda, what's wrong? He thought. But there was no response. Quickly he heard the doors around him open, and Sansan, Yami, Kiba, Netsu, and Shiruku came out in their pajamas. Except obviously Sansan. What was that? Kiba asked in a panic. That sounded like Yonda screaming, Shiruka said. But I don't see her anywhere. Netsu looked around. She's not responding to my thoughts either, Fu told them, getting more and more concerned. There you are. Fu turned around and saw Nara running towards them with Eri, Otoko, Kyoku, and Kei with her. All still in their pajamas much like the others. Except for Otoko, who had hurriedly thrown his cloak on. What happened? Is Yonda alright? Eri asked, clearly fearful for her sister. We don't know. I haven't seen her and she's not responding. Fu once again explained, looking at Nara's group, he noticed someone was missing. Where's Ken? Probably still snoozing. Nara shook her head disapprovingly. When he goes to sleep almost nothing wakes him up. But enough about him, we need to find Yonda. Just then, Mu came out of his dimension in front of everyone, scaring the crap out of them as it looked like he appeared out of thin air. Help! Dad, Yonda, the office. Help! Mu shouted at them, appearing disheveled and was hyperventilating. Apparently, that was all Mu could take as he almost immediately ducked back into his dimension. Who was that? Nara asked. Almost everyone else looked unsure as well, seeing as only Fuku had really personally seen Mu. I think that was Mu, he looks like how Dad described him. Fu answered, it looks like something went wrong with Dad and Yonda in his office, we should hurry, it must have been serious for Mu to show himself like that. Kiba threw back to yesterday. With the blood, she smelled coming from her father. And immediately fear gripped her, as she put two and two together. And so without a word, which was unlike her, she bolted towards Izuku's office. Naturally, no one else really could catch up to her, and she made her way to Izuku's office. She kicked the door off its hinges and was met with a horrifying sight. There in her father's office were Izuku and Yonda. Both passed out and were unconscious. Yonda was mostly fine, it seemed like she had passed out from shock. The real horror was with Izuku, who was limp on his desk that was dripping with his blood. For a moment Kiba was frozen in shock. Horror gripping her heart. Never has the sight of blood looked so unappealing to her. The paralysis didn't last long, as she dashed forward, grabbing the desk and throwing it aside, letting Izuku fall on top of her. Daddy! Kiba quickly laid Izuku out on the floor. She saw that the blood was coming from his mouth and not a stab wound or anything, but that was little comfort as he was still bleeding and not responding. Kiba started to hyperventilate as she lowered her ear to his chest, and much to her relief his heart was still beating. But after that, she didn't know what to do. She tried shaking Izuku but he wasn't responding at all. And the longer this went on the more she panicked. Daddy! Kiba started crying, scared out of her mind for her adopted father. Meanwhile, everyone else, Fu, Nara, Eri, Otoko, Shiruku, Netsu, Sansan, Kyoku, Kei, and Yami, all caught up, and saw Kiba weeping over Izuku's limp body with blood on his face. The reactions varied. Yami, Kei, Netsu, and Shiruku all ran over to his body, all screaming out in concern. Eri and Kyoku just stood there, too afraid and panicked to even move. Sansan just melted. She was so shocked by this, that she was unable to maintain her form, and thus just turned into a pile of goo on the floor. Nara, Fu, and Otoko were all standing in shock. Although not for very long. Fu, predictably, was the first one to take charge. Someone get Dad's phone and call an ambulance. Fu shouted out to the others. He looked at the desk that Kiba had thrown aside, and saw that the phone had been tossed aside nearby. He uses one of Kaiosei's tentacles to pick up the phone. Luckily it wasn't broken. After typing in the password, which only he and a few others knew in case of emergency, he called for help. All while watching his siblings panic and cry. If one could see it, the only word that could be used to describe it was disaster. Sometime later, Fuku had a feeling something was wrong. Firstly, this was normally around the time someone would bring her breakfast. Whether it be Izuku, Kei, or Eri. But today they were late. Very late. Did I do something wrong? Oh no, what did I do? Are they gonna leave me to starve? Oh God. Fuku was naturally beginning to panic, and that is when there was a knock on the door. "It's me and Eri, can you let us in?" It was Kay, and something was wrong. She was lacking her usual peppiness. And Kay was never lacking in peppiness. Concern bubbled up inside her, alongside her fears. What is Kay so sad about? Is it something involving me? Is Izuku getting rid of me? What could they be so sad about? 1,000 fearful thoughts flew through her head, but all of them only lasted for a second, before they were silenced by one singular thought. "Stupid Fuku. Your friends are hurting. What else could possibly matter?" And so, with more confidence than she ever felt in most of her life, she went over and opened the door. When the door opened, she was met with a sight that broke her heart. Kay was trying to keep herself together, and if Fuku was an idiot she might have believed she was okay, given that her visor covered her teary eyes, and Kay was wearing a forced smile. But the smile was very obviously forced, the snakes on her head were slumped over and sad. Eri was barely even trying to hide her distress. Her normally ruby red eyes were bloodshot red, and she could still see the tear tracks on her face. Her hair was an absolute mess, as she was still wearing her pajamas. She hid behind Kay as if trying not to let Fuku see her in such a way. Never in her life has she seen her closest friends look so defeated, and all she could ask was, "What happened?" Dad he got sick, and he was bleeding, and Kay tried to explain it, but she was very evidently falling apart and Eri wasn't doing much better, as she started tearing up behind her. He's in the hospital An. Fuku didn't let her continue, and instead just brought the two inside, and wrapped them into a hug. The other two immediately hugged her back and started sobbing. Fuku liked Izuku. Heck, she even kind of looks up to him. So hearing that something like this had happened, was horrible. But she knew that to Kay and Eri, he was their father, and she couldn't imagine how they must feel. So she pushed her own feelings aside, she could worry and cry about Izuku later. Her precious friends needed her. And so she grasped onto strength she never knew she had, and carried on. Meanwhile, in Kai's room, Kai woke up with a huge yawn. It was a beautiful day outside. The sun was shining, birds were singing and the kaiju boy was confident that today would be another wonderful day. And then the world sent Fu in there to tell him otherwise. Fu looked as he normally would, so Kai didn't suspect that anything was wrong. But on the inside, while calling him a mess would be inaccurate. Due to his quirk holding back his emotions, he wasn't overwhelmed by sadness and fear, but the sadness and fear were present. As well as a deep feeling of frustration. "Fu, good morning." Kai eagerly greeted his older brother. "Is Kiba doing another stream?" Kai was such a good boy. Such a good, happy, nice boy. And it killed Fu to have to say what he was going to say. But he already died once, so what was another one? "No. I don't think Kiba's gonna be streaming for a while." Fu sighed. Kai gave him confused looks. He has 3 heads, so it looks not look. Kiba not streaming? That's not like her at all? Wait. She's not sick, is she? Fu shook his head. "No, she's not sick, but Dad is." The giant boy's 3 sets of eyes widened with concern and fear. What? Dad's sick? He was bleeding and he wouldn't wake up, so we had to get him to the hospital, Fu explained to him, looking away so he didn't have to see Kai's expression. Waha, why? Tears started leaking out of Kai's eyes, hitting the ground like huge raindrops the size of toddlers. One of them fell onto Fu, drenching him instantly. As Kai sobbed, Fu decided to comfort him. So after a bit of climbing using Kaiosiai's tentacles, Fu made his way to Kai's head and gently hugged the top of his skull. Meanwhile, in Ken's room, Ken was currently fast asleep on his bed, snoozing without a care in the world. And then he was pushed off his bed onto the floor. Ow! Ken jolted awake from the pain of his noggin crashing onto the ground and was immediately irritated with whoever did that. And he already knew who it was. "Wake up!" Nara shouted at him, staring down at him anxiously. What the heck was that for? Ken pulled himself to his feet and glared daggers at his sister. Izuku got sick and had to go to the hospital. "I need you to get up so we can figure out what to do now," Nara swiftly explained, trying to convey the urgency of the situation as much as she could in as little time as possible. Wait, what? If Ken was not fully awake before he was now. Izuku's sick, what happened to him? We don't know. All we know is that we heard Yonda screaming, and we found her passed out from shock and Izuku passed out bleeding on his desk. He wasn't waking up, so we had to call the hospital to take him away. Nara explained, once again as quickly as she could. I think he overworked himself. I mean, he is the only employee here. Oh, man, Ken muttered, his eyes wide in shock. Ken and Nara hadn't known Izuku for very long, but they'd come to like him as a guardian figure that watched over them. So him being in this state was a real bummer, to say the least. Most of the other kids are panicking, it's chaos out there. Me and the other kids who aren't freaking out are all meeting in the cafeteria to figure out what to do. That includes you. Nara threw some clothes at him. So get dressed. Ken, for once, quickly did what she told him to do, without complaint. Before following her to the cafeteria. A few moments later, in the cafeteria, Ken, Nara, Fu, and Otoko were all gathered, sitting down at one of the lunch tables. There was a seer orb next to Nara, just so that way she could keep tabs over the house. Why are you wet? Ken asked Fu, whose entire body was still soaked. I had to tell Kai about what happened to Dad, and he started crying, Fu explained. As you can see, his tears are as big as you'd expect. Let's focus here, guys. Nara brought everyone's attention to her. First, where is everyone and what are they doing? Last I checked, Eri and Kei were with Fukinoko, crying. Kai is in his room, also crying. Kiba, Kyoku, and Yami have locked themselves in their rooms and are probably crying. Netsu and Sansan have gone outside to vent out some stress, and probably also cry. Shiroku is in her room trying to keep it together while stress eating and crying. Yonda is still passed out, but she'll probably wake up and cry, and I have no idea where Mu is, but he's probably either in his room or in his dimension, crying. Fu explained. So everyone but us is freaking out and crying. Ken summarized. Great. Suddenly Ken's stomach growled, setting off a chain reaction of people of stomach growls. Okay, the second thing we need to figure out. Who is making food? Nara asked them all. Because Ken and I can't cook. Hey Fu, isn't your whole thing that you eat a ton of food? Don't you know how to cook? Ken asked the zombie boy hopefully while clutching his stomach. Fu shook his head. I can't get sick, and I can't taste anything. So I just eat all my food raw. Gross. Nara cringed before everyone turned to Otoko. Otoko shook his head, signifying that he indeed could not cook. Everyone wilted a bit as they realized they may have a situation on their hands. I think Yonda and Yami know how to cook, but they're out of commission. Fu sighed. And the only other one who can cook is Dash. Me, said an unfamiliar voice from the entrance. Everyone looked towards the door and saw Fuku walking in, with her hoodie over her face. Fuku? Fu was actually shocked. He figured that Fuku would have definitely stayed in her room with Eri and Kei for a long time, maybe even days. Isn't that the super shy girl that hides in her room all day every day? Ken asked bluntly. Yep, that's her, Fu confirmed. What happened to Kei and Eri? They're with Kyoku. I wanted to help, Fuku admitted. You need someone who can cook, right? Well, I know how. If that's alright with everyone. Hey, I'm not complaining about not going hungry. Do what you want. Ken told her. Yeah, thank you for coming. We really appreciate the help. Nara smiled at her, trying to reassure her. Fuku blushed slightly under her hoodie. I'll go into the kitchen now. Just as she was about to run off, Fu spoke up. Wait. Let Otoko come with you, you'll need him to help you get stuff off the tall shelves and lift heavy things. Is that really necessary? In truth, Fuku was already freaking out as it was. She desperately wanted to run back to her room, but she was determined to stick around and help, if only for Eri and Kei's sake, also her own because if no one was cooking then they would all die of starvation anyway. But she wouldn't lie and say that Otoko's imposing figure and horrifying physique didn't make her have second thoughts. Well, it's either him or you get to deal with the Grim. Fu already knew what her answer was gonna be. Never mind, I'll work with him. Fuku had barely seen the Grim, but from her limited experience with them, she knew they were not something she would be comfortable working about, to say the least. Alright, I'll take care of my own and Kai's food by the way. That doesn't really involve any cooking anyway. Fu told her. Alright. Okay. Fuku responded, trying very carefully not to do anything to offend anyone. Can I start cooking now? Yes, go ahead, Fu told her. Immediately Fuku bolted towards the kitchen, running so fast it was a wonder she didn't trip on her way there. Otoko got up from the table and followed her, at a significantly slower pace. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, Nara spoke, up allowing them to continue the discussion. What do we do now? Did Izuku leave any instructions in case something like this happened? Ken rolled his eyes. Do you really think he'd plan on Dash? Actually he did. Fu pulled out a note from his pocket. Ken crossed his arms while Nara gave him a smug face, but only for a second, before getting back to business. Alright, the note is mostly just him apologizing and putting himself down, but the actual instructions say that we should call Grandma and ask her to come over here to take care of us. And if that takes too long we should ask the wild pussycats for help. Fu explained. Wait, isn't that a hero group? Nara asked, confused as to how they would be involved. Izuka would baby Koda, a kid that was under their care, so they kind of owe him one. Fu explained. They're weird, but they're pretty good at their jobs and they know how to do all the adult stuff. So we should just focus on holding out until they get here. Alright. Until then, the three of us should take on all the house chores, along with the Grim. Nara ordered. Right. Fu agreed. Right. Ken groaned, hesitantly agreeing. He wasn't a huge fan of doing more work, but he also knew that he didn't really have much of a choice given the situation. Nara sighed. I hope whatever Fukunoko makes is nutritious because I have a feeling I'm going to need the energy.